By now, everyone's already talked about how amazingly well crafted and atmospheric and just entertaining the Demon Slayer is and how well it's trying to portray this Japanese feel in it. But to be honest, it's not only just the feel, really. The anime and the manga, of course, it's actually very historically accurate and is well researched, trying to keep up with the era that it's portraying. So let's not busy ourselves with the basics again and let's talk about fashion history in Demon Slayer. Of all things. But to start off, we need to know where the anime is actually taking place.
From a few of the characters' claims, we know we are in the Taisha period Japan, but we can even go more detailed based on the fight between Tanjiro and the hand demon during his exam. The demon says that he still remembers the day when he fought rokutaki 47 years ago, claiming it was during the Keijo era of Edo period.
And doing the math and adding the 47 years to the 3 years of the Keijo era, so that being from 1865 till 1868, we would end up somewhere in 1912 to 1915, so somewhere in the beginning of the Taisho period. And bear in mind, I didn't have math lessons since 80 years ago?
It is also very apparent when in the history of Japan we are when we look at the scenery of Tokyo when Tanjiro goes there for a mission in the episode 7. We can clearly see a very big Western influence that has already overtaken Japan at the time. A lot of people on the streets were already wearing Western-style clothing, were using automobiles, wearing hats and living in the big Western-style buildings. This episode especially shows Asakusa in Tokyo, which funnily enough now is one of the most traditional parts of the city. But considering the time period, we can clearly see the changes that were taking place in Japan at the time, as they had to very quickly catch up to the rest of the world.
But first, let's do a very quick rundown of like 300 years of Japanese history, so more or less we know what we're dealing with here. Let's go.
Japan from the Edo period, so from around the 17th century, was closed off from the rest of the world because the shogun didn't like Western people sticking their big noses into his playground, and because of that, the Japanese stayed basically on the same level of development for around 3 centuries. Then, in the 19th century, came Matthew Perry from America and say, hey, open up! And Japanese complied because they had nothing to fight them with, because what harm would a sword do to a cannon? And then came Meiji period, when a lot of modernization thanks to the Western influence started happening. The swords and kimonos were slowly replaced by guns and trousers, the education bloomed, and people started very quickly taking in more and more parts of Western inventions, like infrastructure, medicine, trains, ships, or even government.
And that's how we end up in the Taisha period, when the Western influence is only getting stronger and more mainstream, especially in the big cities. It would still take a lot of time for the Japanese people to completely adapt to the new Western lifestyle, but in Taisho it was already clear in what direction Japan was heading. Away from the tradition and into modernization. It was still a time in between the old Japan and the new one, and it is visible in the clothes of the people living in Tokyo. Some of them were wearing Western clothes and some were still wearing kimonos.
But that doesn't mean that the entire country looked like Tokyo in the 7th episode and the author of the Demon Slayer just made up this ancient-looking town that Tanjiro lived in. It's actually very historically accurate. This kind of modernization wouldn't really travel that fast at the time, and it would be the most apparent in the center of the country, so like the big cities. But the countryside, and especially the mountainous region like the one that Tanjiro lived in, would be very far behind the cities, and they would still be living the same way that they used to for centuries before.
That's why his house, clothes and surroundings resemble more something from the Edo period rather than the 1910s, and why he was so surprised when he first arrived in Tokyo. He just probably had no idea all of this was happening.
And to be honest, because of that, I was quite shocked when they said that it's Taisho period. I just seriously thought that it was supposed to be some imaginary version of fantasy Japan loosely based off of Edo period. Not straight out historically accurate Taisho period with just people not knowing that demons exist. But the clothes of our characters actually represent that period very well, and I was very pleasantly surprised how much thought and meaning and symbolism the author put into those clothes, and the more I looked into it, the more I found out, so let's see that.
Let's start off with the basics, so the uniforms of the Demon Slayers. They wear a uniform called gakuran, consisting of a black trousers and black button-up jacket with a stiff collar.
Gaku in the name means study, and ran comes from the word Oranda, which means Netherlands, but it doesn't mean studying Dutch. It implicates that something is Western, actually. Because for centuries of isolation, Japan only allowed Dutch people to keep in contact with them and to trade goods in the small island of Dejima in today's Nagasaki. For 3 centuries, the Dutch were the only foreigners that Japanese knew, so everything that they brought into the country was associated with them, by the name at least, even if they weren't the ones that created them. That's also how the word rangaku was created, and it was a term describing every piece of knowledge brought into Japan by the Dutch, and it means Dutch studies, but what they really meant by it was Western studies.
And it was the same with the gakuran. It was a type of uniform first taken by the Japanese military and then transformed into a boys' school uniform, but it was based off of Prussian military uniforms, not Dutch ones. They first appeared in Meiji period and were slowly getting more and more popular among the schools and universities, eventually completely replacing the uniforms established at the start of the period, which consisted of a simple hakama, white pants, and kimono with a shirt underneath, which you can see on the pictures here. It is dated at around the Meiji period or the beginning of the Taisha period, and you can see the students wearing the old types of uniforms with some extra coats called haori and the Western style hats. But on the other picture here, you can see both uniforms on the students, showing they were both in use at the same time. The old one, as I said, was gradually replaced by the gakuran though, and at some point it became a universal boys' uniform all around Japan and is still in use to this day. So giving this type of uniform to the military group slaying demons at the time of the Taisha period is absolutely historically accurate. They wouldn't be paired up with the haori normally, the type of coat worn with kimono, like our group does, but I think that might be interpreted as the slayers living somewhere in between the traditional and modern Japan.
On one hand, there is a semi-official military force of modernizing Japan, and on the other they slay creatures from Japanese folk tales, so I'd say that's very fitting. But the old style of the uniform from the Meiji period also gets an appearance because Yushiro wears it actually.
That choice of attire matches perfectly with his life story, as he turned into a demon, so he basically died, at least a few years before we meet him. And his clothes that come from the previous period indicate just that.
And that's great attention to detail, dear Mr. Gotoge. Thank you. But now let's go to the first episode though, because actually Tanjiro wears a few different sets of clothes throughout the series, so let's talk about them.
When we first see him, he of course has his signature haori, which I'm gonna discuss later, and he wears what could be a peasant's or a traveler's clothes from the Edo or Meiji period. Or again, even later, if we're talking about countryside, which we are talking, so that's accurate. He has a short kimono reaching his thighs and a narrow pants tied around his ankles, which, considering he's a working young man from a lower class family, is exactly what you would expect from his clothes.
I mean, for him, the free range of movement was more valuable than being fashionable in the hakama.
Nezuko, on the other hand, wears a typical kimono. The shape of the kimono changed only slightly since the Edo period. Until today, it stayed almost the same in structure, but there are a few different types of them for different occasions. What Nezuko is wearing here is a typical casual kimono for everyday use called common, which is characterized by the same pattern repeated all over the garment. She also wears a set of winter footwear, different to her mother's, probably because she was just walking around in the snow trying to put to sleep her sibling. This scene and the fact that she has her hair put up, unlike her younger sister, shows that even though she was only 12 at the time, she was considered almost an adult already, as it was a sign of stepping into adulthood for a woman, which is historically accurate as people at the time still married earlier, especially in the countryside. After turning into a demon, her hair obviously is set loose, indicating the change that happened in her. She also started wearing her kimono tied up, reaching only her calves, just like the travelers, male or female, would do to allow a full range of motion again. Again, indicating here the change in her and the journey she is on. The details of her clothes don't end there though. Very rarely can we see in anime undergarments of the kimono called dubon, which is a thin cotton layer underneath the expensive kimono that would protect it from the sweat. Most of the time authors put the color of it visible like it would normally be, but Gotoge took it a bit further and we can see it visible on the hem of her kimono. And we also get an entire scene of Nezuko just in her juban when she was just turned into a demon.
Yeah, an entire scene with her basically in her underwear. I mean, she's 12, what the hell? And yeah, showing a juban is just a simple thing, but it actually shows how much thought the author put into it, considering that in today's Japan, most people come in contact with the traditional clothing through yukata, which you wear without this underlayer. Now let's talk about the most interesting and the signature part of the series, which are the haori, or more specifically about the patterns on them.
Once again, the haori is a type of a coat worn over a kimono for extra warmth typically. And in Demon Slayer we have a whole array of many different more and more colorful ones that just look like they are taken out from a fever dream after New Year's rendezvous with too much vodka and too little food. But, surprisingly, most of the patterns used on the haoris of our main characters are traditional geometrical patterns used on kimonos for centuries.
The world of kimono is actually full of symbolism, and the patterns more often than not carry some kind of meaning and are assigned to specific seasons or occasions, though not all, and some of them can be quite universal and worn year-round.
For example, kimonos with plum flowers are worn in the winter because that's when they bloom, but geometrical patterns like samekomon can be worn whenever.
But just like in the real world, sometimes, the Demon Slayer patterns also carry quite a lot of meaning. They are used to symbolize some aspects of the character's personality, but they also would connect different characters with each other, especially showing the familial bond, but not only.
Like with the Kocha family or Rui's made-up spider family, they all had similarly patterned clothes associating them with each other, but those are not the traditional ones actually taken from the Japanese culture, at least from what I know. So let's talk about those more, as I think they hold much more meaning than the others.
First, let's talk about Tanjiro's checkered pattern.
It's called Ichimatsu and was supposedly used since ancient times, but became the most popular during the Edo period after kabuki actor called Sanogawa Ichimatsu used it on his hakama. It's supposed to mean prosperity. We mainly associate it with Tanjiro, but you can actually see it on every single member of his family. His mother has an entire kimono in it, Nezuko has an obi belt, and the rest of his siblings also wear different elements of clothing with it. From the scenes with their father, we can see that he was probably the one who introduced the pattern into his family, as he was seen wearing the exact same haori Tanjiro wears, just in different color. That pattern is specifically said to mean the prosperity of descendants, so it's very fitting to be used by an entire family.
Though it's hard to swallow once you remember what happened to that family. But I still think that Tanjiro wearing that pattern actually symbolizes his father's protection over him, even though the rest of the family got killed.
Nezuko, however, not only wears her family's pattern, she also has another traditional pattern on her pink kimono. This one is called Asanoja, called after the hemp leaves as it resembles it. This pattern also been around since ancient times and was used in holy rituals. Now it's mostly used for the clothes for babies because it's said to represent long and healthy life.
But it also symbolizes protection against evil, strength and beauty, and if that doesn't describe Nezuko, then I don't know what does.
I mean, the girl can certainly protect when she has to. Tanjiro also wore his master's rokutaki's haori with his signature pattern on it, showing through that the master-student bond. This pattern is called Seigaiha, and normally it's more geometrical, but can also appear in a similar shape to the one from the series. It first appeared around the 6th century, and it was used on maps to represent seas, so of course it symbolizes water, which is very fitting for a master of water breathing.
But it also symbolizes power and resistance, which are considered the keys to the Japanese culture and certainly to the samurai culture. And with Urokotaki being a very traditional samurai man, we really shouldn't expect anything else from him, right?
Zenitsu's pattern is called uroko, and it was made to resemble the scales of a snake or a fish. It was known since ancient times as well, and has a meaning of taking off bad luck, chasing away evil spirits, and because of that, it was very popular with the samurai and was worn as a kind of a lucky charm.
And I mean, Zenitsu certainly thinks that he needs all the good luck in the world to survive, so I'd say that fits. Also, he got that pattern from his grandpa, so again, the connection between the characters and the familial bond and all that stuff. And the last from the traditional geometrical patterns that I've noticed is the one that Tomioka is actually wearing.
He's wearing a pattern called kikko. It's supposed to resemble a tortoise shell and symbolizes longevity. It was also often used by the samurais in their armor.
And here a spoiler alert for anyone who's only an anime watcher, which, to be honest, I am too, but then I noticed something when researching for this video and I spoiled myself, so I only have myself to blame. Anyways,
Tomioka's haori is actually half his old one he used when he was Urokodaki's student, and half Sabito's, the dead boy we met when Tanjiro was training for his exam. We learn later in the manga that he died protecting Tomioka during his final exam. Tomioka, as I spoiled myself, still lives with the survival syndrome and feels like him outliving everyone is a curse.
Which, having those kinds of thoughts and wearing a pattern symbolizing longevity. Well played, Mr. Gotoge. Well played. You really want me to ugly cry, don't you?
And again, the pattern they wear symbolized the bond connecting them, this time not a familial one, but certainly a deeply emotional one. It's probably a symbol of Tomioka's guilt and grief as well.
If I'm being honest, I think that Demon Slayer is a very solid anime. It's very entertaining and well thought out, but it's not revolutionary. But after diving deep into the historical aspects and the traditional pattern symbolism used in it, I appreciated the work put into creating it much more. I really didn't think that this much attention to detail was put into the character design. I mean, Gotoge could have just put them in some cool looking clothes and no one would have batted an eye at that, but instead, he actually thought it all through, put it all into the historical context, gave the clothes the meaning and also connected the characters through the clothes. I don't say that a lot about anime lately. That's impressive.